Excel error help 12 asks in the Excel subreddit if formula that displays singular or dual funding types relative to date. Hello all, in this formula it will work off of two worksheets. The first is formulas worksheet where the formula will be inserted. Then he has some data and then he says you will create a formula that analyzes what funding type on funding data is being used for the owner on the first sheet. If the owner is using API, you put API. If it's TPI, TPI, and if it's both, you put API/TPI. It needs to work relative to the start and the end date and the respective owner. And so he will paste it in a certain cell and then he needs to drag it down so it works for every case. Now, this was quite a complex formula to design, definitely not easy. So I made some assumptions as to how the data looks like. As you can see, we have our master data here. We have the funding type API or TPI, a date and an owner. And then we have a start and an end date over here. And then what you want to fill out is this list over here. So we have the owner and then we need to fill out API or TPI depending on what we find here in the master data. And it has to match the owner and be in between the start and the end date. Now, this is quite a lot of criteria, so we'll have to slowly build up the needed formula. So first of all, I want to filter down my data so that it only contains data between the start and end dates. So we can do that using a filter function. So we use a filter and then we provide all of the data like so, and then we have to tell to the filter function what we want to include. Now, each criteria we put in between brackets. So the first criteria I want to include, that's that the date, so the date column, needs to be larger than or equal to the start date. Okay, then I go to the second criteria, and so I add each criteria with a multiplication, right? And how it works is if in the end it's more than 1, it will include it. If it's 0, so for each criteria it will either be 1 or 0. So if it's 0, it will not be included. So the moment one criteria does not match, the row will not be included. So for the second criteria, I once again select the date. And so the date needs to be smaller than or equal to the end date. Very good. And then I have the last criteria, and that's that it needs to match the name of the owner. So I select the list here of owners, and it must be equal to the name of the owner over here. Now I can close the parentheses, and I also make sure to add absolute references to all of my references except for the one referencing the name of the owner over here. But all of the other references, I want them to stay absolutely fixed. So I place $signs in front of the letters and the numbers. And you can use the shortcut F4 to do this. Like so. I make sure not to absolutely reference the name of the owner over here in cell E5. So if I press enter, you can see what we are getting back is a list of all of the rows that match the specific criteria. So here we get back the list of Bob, the list of Abby, and here for Jim we have 2 results, these, right? And so for Bob, one of the results is outside of the date range, so Bob only returns 1. So far so good. Now we get a bunch of redundant data. Really the only thing we're interested in is this first column over here. So we can achieve this by wrapping all of this in another filter function. So filter, and then as the include, we simply supply it a list of zeros and ones, and so each number represents the position of the column that you want to include. So the first column we want to include, so we put a 1, and then the second and the third column we don't want to include, so we put zeros, and we put this in between curly braces. Now I close the filter function, press enter, and as you can see, this will now only return the first column as such. These API and TPI variables we'll have to use a lot. So if we want to reuse them, it's a good idea to use them within a let function. What a let function allows us to do is to assign a variable name to a certain calculation, and then we don't have to repeat the calculation, but we can simply reference the variable name. So in this case, we will call it A, and so this entire result will be referenceable through the variable A. Of course, you could give it a more descriptive name, but for now we'll go with the variable A. And then the second argument is whichever the variable A represents. And the third argument is a normal calculation like we would normally do in Excel. Now, to structure our function a little bit better, I've pressed Alt-Enter to go to the next line in my formula editor. That way I can structure the formula better. So now I want to check these values that were returned with the filter functions, and I want to check what they contain. And I will do this using an ifs function. What an ifs function does, it is checked a logical condition. If it's true, it returns a value, and otherwise it goes on and checks another logical condition, and it continues like that. So very similar to an if function, but we can check multiple conditions. So I use an ifs function. Now I need to check the most restrictive criteria first, because the ifs condition or the ifs for a function is evaluated from left to right. So we first want to do the most restrictive one, and that would be an owner who is funded both through API and TPI. So that's what we'll check first, and we can use an AND statement to check multiple conditions. So what we need to check is if whatever was returned contains the word API or TPI, and we can do this using a match function. Now a match function will return a value if it has found a position of a certain piece of text. So we're looking for the word API, and we're looking for the word API in whatever was returned by the filter functions. So now we don't need to retype the entire formula, we can simply put A. And now we're looking for an exact match, so then we put a 0. Now this match will return a number if it found the word API. So in order to convert this to a true or false value, we'll use the isNumber function. Okay, so if we found the word API, this will return a number, and if it returns a number, this will return true, and so that's the first condition for our AND. Now we do the same thing, but for TPI, and the second argument to our AND function. So if both TPI and API were found in the list that was returned by the filters, then we know we need to return API-TPI. Okay. If both names or funding types were not found within the filter, well, then we know it does not contain both, and we need to do additional checks. So then we check if it just contains only API. So then we take this over here, isNumber, match type API. If that's the case, then we will be returning simply API. And now if it does not contain API, then we check if it contains TPI. So we can do that with this. And so then we return TPI. And so if we still haven't found any matches, then we want to use the else category. And so we can do this by simply typing true. So this will always be true because it's simply true. And then we simply return nothing. But do keep in mind that we only reach this true statement if all other logical tests have failed, right? Because the ifs function is executed from left to right. So now we close the parentheses as such, and we press enter and hope that we wrote everything correct. Seems like we made an error somewhere. Okay, I think I spotted the error. So here we have isNumber, and here we want to end the AND statement, which we didn't do. So we have to add an additional parentheses over there. I think this should work. Still not? Oh, we forgot a comma after the API TPI. So let's try this again. Yeah, there we go. So now we pull this through, and as you can see, it works as expected. So Bob receives API. Why? He has one API funding type in between the respective dates. So this TPI is not counted. Abby has TPI because she only has one TPI, and Jim has both API and TPI because both those funding types are matching. So this was quite a difficult function, but it truly shows the power of using let, because otherwise, without let, each time you spot the A, which is 4 times, we would have to put this entire formula. So the let function really has saved us some time. And so we've combined filters with a match and an if statement to build this really good formula to indicate if somebody matches either one of those cases. It's a bit convoluted, and perhaps there's an easier way, but this was what I was able to come up with.